At approximately 4 p.m. on the 14th of April 1935, the sky over the Oklahoma Panhandle began to change. It was a Sunday afternoon. Families were finishing lunch. Children played in yards. The wind had been blowing all day, but that was not unusual for the southern plains. Then from the northwest, a wall appeared. It was not a cloud. It was not a thunderstorm. It was a solid, moving mass of brown and black, rising 2 miles into the air. Witnesses later described it as a rolling mountain of dirt traveling at 60 miles per hour. Some thought it was the end of the world. At 4:20 p.m., the front hit the town of Guymon, Oklahoma. Visibility dropped to zero within seconds. The air became thick with dust. People could not breathe. They covered their mouths with wet cloths, but the particles were fine enough to slip through. Cars pulled off roads. Drivers abandoned their vehicles and crawled toward buildings by feel. Inside homes, families stuffed wet towels under doors and around windows. The dust found its way anyway. It coated furniture. It seeped into closets. It settled in a fine layer over plates of food that had been left on tables just minutes before. At 4:45 p.m., the storm reached Liberal, Kansas. The same scene repeated. Schools let children stay inside. Teachers lit lamps, but the light barely penetrated the haze. Telephones went dead. Radios crackled with static. In some places, the darkness lasted for more than 30 minutes. When the storm finally passed, the ground was covered in a new layer of dirt. Drifts of soil, 4 to 5 feet deep, piled up against fences and barns. Roads were buried. Pastures were erased. Livestock had suffocated in the fields. That Sunday became known as Black Sunday. It was the worst single dust storm of the decade, but it was not the first and not the last. By the time the drought and the dust receded, the American Great Plains had lost an estimated 850 million tons of topsoil in a single day. The storm itself affected an area roughly 900 miles long and 400 miles wide. It stretched from the Canadian border down to Texas, from Colorado east to Kansas. What happened that afternoon was not an accident of weather. It was the result of a collision between human decisions and natural forces. To understand why the sky turned black, you have to go back 20 years before Black Sunday. In the early 1900s, the Southern Plains were promoted as the last great agricultural frontier. Railroads, land speculators, and the federal government encouraged settlement. The Homestead Act had been expanded. Advertisements promised fertile soil and abundant rain. Thousands of families moved into western Kansas, eastern Colorado, the Oklahoma Panhandle, the Texas Panhandle, and parts of New Mexico. They plowed up the native prairie grasses, which had held the thin topsoil in place for thousands of years. The roots of those grasses, some of them 4 feet deep, had acted as a net, binding the soil against wind and water. The plowing was made possible by new technology. Tractors had replaced horses. Efficient disc plows could turn over 10 to 20 acres a day. During World War I, wheat prices soared and farmers responded by planting every acre they could. After the war, prices fell, but the plowing continued. By the early 1930s, more than 30 million acres of native sod had been turned. The soil was deep, dark, and rich in nutrients. For a few years, the yields were high. Then the rain stopped. It was not a brief dry spell. It was a drought that lasted from 1934 through 1937, and in some areas through 1940. The center of the region received less than half its normal annual precipitation. The soil, no longer held by grass roots, began to dry. Without moisture, the topsoil broke down into a fine, powdery silt. When the wind blew, there was nothing to stop it. The first severe dust storms came in 1932, but they were localized. In 1933, the number and intensity increased. In 1934, a massive storm stripped topsoil from farms in the Dakotas and carried it hundreds of miles east, depositing it on the decks of ships in the Atlantic Ocean and on the streets of Washington, D.C. by the winter of 1934-1935. The plains were in crisis. Black Sunday was not a surprise to meteorologists. They had been tracking a cold front moving south from Canada. They knew that the dry, exposed soil would lift into the air, but there was no effective warning system. People learned about the approaching storm by looking at the horizon. By the time they saw it, there was no escape. The question that followed was straightforward. How could the land turn to dust? Investigators in the years after Black Sunday searched for answers. They were not detectives in the usual sense, but soil scientists, economists, and government officials. What they found was a pattern of human failure carefully layered over natural conditions. The first and most direct cause was the plowing of the grasslands. The prairies had evolved to survive drought. The deep-rooted grasses could reach moisture far underground and hold the soil when the surface was dry. When farmers replaced those grasses with wheat, they removed the natural defense. Wheat roots were shallow. When the drought came, the wheat died and the bare soil had nothing holding it. The second cause was the scale of the farming operation. Many of the farmers who moved into the region were not experienced in dryland farming. They had come from the Midwest, where rain was more reliable. They used the same techniques: deep plowing, row cropping, leaving fields bare between harvests. Those techniques worked in wetter climates, but they were disastrous on the plains. The third cause was financial pressure. The Great Depression had already destroyed the price of wheat. Farmers needed to plant more acres just to cover their debts. They borrowed money to buy tractors and land. When the dust storms came, they could not afford to leave the land fallow or plant cover crops. They kept trying. The soil kept blowing. The government response began in 1933 under the Franklin Roosevelt administration. The Soil Conservation Service was created in 1935, partly as a direct result of the dust storms. Hugh Hammond Bennett, a soil scientist, became its first director. He had been warning about soil erosion for decades. With the Dust Bowl, he finally had evidence that could not be ignored. He testified before Congress in 1935 during a dust storm that darkened the sky over Washington. He told lawmakers that the nation was losing its soil faster than it could be replaced. The Soil Conservation Act was passed that same year. But the problem was not merely technical. It was social and economic. The people living in the Dust Bowl were trapped. They had invested everything in the land. They had families, mortgages, and a way of life tied to farming. Many did not want to leave. Others could not afford to. Relief programs like the Resettlement Administration tried to move struggling families to better land, but the scale of the displacement exceeded what the government could manage. The human consequences of the Dust Bowl have been well documented, but they bear repeating because they were not abstract. In 1934, the town of Dalhart, Texas, recorded 98 days with dust storms. In 1935, the number was 85. In 1936, it was 151. People developed a condition called dust pneumonia, caused by inhaling silica particles. The lungs could not clear the dust. Children and the elderly were especially vulnerable. No one kept precise records, but estimates from the time suggest that several thousand people died from respiratory complications directly related to the dust. Animals died in larger numbers. Cattle inhaled dust and developed what farmers called dust colic. Their eyes crusted over. They starved because the grass was buried. In some counties, half the livestock was lost. Wild animals like jackrabbits and prairie dogs also died, but the jackrabbit population boomed in some places because their natural predators, like hawks and coyotes, had been killed off by farmers. The remaining rabbits competed with livestock for feed. The government organized rabbit drives where men would chase hundreds of rabbits into pens and club them to death. By 1937, the drought began to ease. Rains returned in 1938 and 1939, but the damage was done. An estimated 2.5 million people left the Plains states during the 1930s. That movement is often called the Dust Bowl migration, but it was not a single wave. Some people left early, after the first severe storms. Others held on until they lost their farms to foreclosure. Many headed west to California, where they became the migrant workers John Steinbeck wrote about in The Grapes of Wrath. The migrants came from Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas, and Missouri. They were called Okies, regardless of their actual origin. They were met with hostility, low wages, and poor living conditions. What investigators later concluded was that the system of farming on the plains had been unsustainable from the start. The land had been treated as an inexhaustible resource, but it was exhaustible. The topsoil that took thousands of years to form was lost in a decade. In some areas, the soil never recovered. In others, it took decades of careful conservation to rebuild. The systems that failed were multiple. The agricultural extension system had promoted wheat cultivation on marginal land without adequate research into long-term risks. The banking system had lent money to farmers who could not afford to lose a single season. The federal land policies had encouraged settlement without understanding the climatic variability of the region. The entire economic structure assumed that good weather would last forever. It did not. The Dust Bowl still matters because it was not an isolated event. Similar conditions exist today in many parts of the world where marginal land is being plowed for agriculture. The lessons about soil conservation, drought planning, and the limits of human ambition have not been fully learned. The Ogallala Aquifer, which underlies much of the same region, is being depleted at rates that far exceed natural recharge. If that water runs out, the southern plains could face a new crisis, not of dust, but of water. The same questions will resurface. What happens when the soil or the water that sustains a civilization is exhausted? The Dust Bowl offered one answer. It was a decade of suffering, displacement, and death. It did not have to happen, and the choices people made led directly to the disaster. In the weeks after Black Sunday, reporters arrived in the Panhandle. They photographed houses buried to the roofline in dirt. They interviewed farmers who had lost everything. One photograph, taken by Arthur Rothstein for the Farm Security Administration, showed a farmer and his two sons walking through a field during a dust storm. That image became one of the most famous of the era. The farmer was later identified as Arthur Cobble, a resident of Cimarron County, Oklahoma. He stayed on his land through the worst years. He survived, but he never recovered what he had lost. There is a moment in the timeline of the Dust Bowl that is often overlooked. It comes between the reports of the first storms in 1932 and the exodus of the late 30s. In the spring of 1933, the Soil Conservation Service did not yet exist. The Resettlement Administration had not been formed. The Civilian Conservation Corps was just getting started. The farmers were alone with their fields. They watched the sky. They saw the horizon darken, and they knew that another storm was coming, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The sky on April 14, 1935, turned black at approximately 4 p.m. That was the moment the nation finally paid attention. But the process that led to that moment had been set in motion 30 years earlier, when the first plow broke the first sod on the Sweetwater Creek watershed. The wind did not cause the Dust Bowl. It was the condition of the land that caused the wind to become destructive. When the soil is healthy, wind is just air moving. When the soil is dead, wind becomes a weapon. In the aftermath of Black Sunday, Congress held hearings. The Department of Agriculture released reports. State governments passed emergency measures. Many of those measures were too late to help the families who had already lost their farms. But they did change how the plains were farmed afterwards. Contour plowing, terracing, strip cropping, and the planting of shelter belts, lines of trees to break the wind, became standard practice. The soil improved. The dust storms of the 1940s and 50s were smaller and less frequent. The region stabilized, but only through deliberate effort. The unanswered question after all the investigations is whether that effort was a lesson learned or just a temporary correction. The same pressures that caused the Dust Bowl are back: high commodity prices, speculative land buying, and the temptation to plow up marginal ground. In the summer of 2021, parts of the Great Plains experienced another severe drought. Dust storms returned to some counties in Kansas and Colorado. They were not as large or as deadly as the storms of the 1930s, but they were a reminder that the soil is never permanently fixed. It is held in place by decisions. When those decisions change, the dust can rise again. On the morning of March 15, 1935, in the town of Liberal, Kansas, the wind began to rise. It was not unusual for March. The plains are always windy in the spring, but this was different. The wind carried a fine brown dust that reduced visibility to less than 100 feet by 10 o'clock. Schools closed early. Store owners turned on their lights at noon. Farmers who had gone out to check on livestock were caught in the open. Some tied handkerchiefs over their faces and tried to follow fence lines back to their homes. Others simply sat down and waited, because moving meant breathing more dust. What happened in Liberal that morning was not an isolated event. It was part of a pattern that had been building for years. The soil that had once been held in place by native grasses was now loose. It had been plowed, pulverized, and left exposed. When the wind reached speeds of 40 miles per hour, that soil became airborne. The particles were fine enough to enter the smallest cracks in houses. They sifted through window frames, under doors, and through the gaps in roof shingles. Families woke up every morning with a layer of dust on their bedsheets, on their dishes, and in their food. The people of Liberal did not know it yet, but the storm that day was part of a larger system that would cover an area of more than 100,000 square miles. The same wind that scoured the fields of Kansas also swept through the Texas Panhandle, western Oklahoma, eastern Colorado, and northeastern New Mexico. By evening, the dust had reached the East Coast. In Washington, D.C., the sky turned yellow. In New York City, ships in the harbor reported reduced visibility. The dust fell on the deck of the USS Wyoming, anchored in the Chesapeake Bay. Who was affected? The immediate answer is the farmers, but the answer runs deeper than that. The Dust Bowl affected every person who lived on the plains during the 1930s. It affected the children who could not go outside to play. It affected the mothers who tried to keep their homes clean and failed. It affected the local merchants who watched their customers default on loans. It affected the bankers who had lent money based on the assumption of stable harvests. It affected the railroad companies that lost freight revenue when grain shipments stopped. It affected the government relief workers who had to decide how to distribute limited aid. But the most direct victims were the families who remained on the land. In 1935, the town of Beaver, Oklahoma, recorded 209 days with dust storms, not days with a little dust in the air. Days when the dust was thick enough to block the sun. The residents of Beaver did not have air conditioning. They did not have modern furnaces with filters. They lived in wood frame houses with single-pane windows. They stuffed rags and wet towels into the gaps, but the dust still came in. When they ate, they tasted grit. When they slept, they woke up coughing. The human body was not designed to inhale large quantities of mineral dust. The lungs can filter some particles, but when the concentration is high enough and the exposure is continuous, the filters fail. The particles lodge in the alveoli, the tiny air sacs where oxygen is exchanged. The body tries to remove them, but silica dust is sharp. It causes scarring. Over time, the scarring reduces lung capacity. The condition became known as dust pneumonia. Autopsies performed at the time showed lungs that were dark gray, almost black, with embedded particles. In some cases, the lungs were more than 50% replaced by scar tissue. How many people died from dust pneumonia? The estimates vary because death records from the era are incomplete. Doctors in rural areas often did not specify the cause. But a 1936 study by the Kansas State Board of Health found that the death rate from pneumonia in the dust-affected counties was more than double the rate in unaffected counties. Extrapolating that data across the entire Dust Bowl region suggests that several thousand people died. The victims were disproportionately young children and elderly adults. In the town of Boise City, Oklahoma, the cemetery recorded 8 burials in a single week in the spring of 1935. 4 of them were children under the age of 5. The animals died too. Cattle were the most economically important. Ranchers tried to keep their herds alive by hauling water and feed from distant sources, but the dust got into everything. The cows developed what was called dust colic. Their stomachs could not process the rough, dry forage that was left. Many died standing up, their eyes crusted shut. In some counties, the livestock loss exceeded 80%. Poultry was even more vulnerable. Chickens could not find food on the bare ground. Their combs and wattles turned black from the dust. Farmers who had raised chickens for eggs and meat watched their flocks die in days. Wildlife suffered too. Prairie dogs, which had been considered pests and poisoned by farmers, actually survived better than other species because they could burrow deep underground. But jackrabbits, which had few predators left, multiplied rapidly. They ate the remaining vegetation and competed with the surviving livestock. The government responded by organizing large-scale rabbit hunts. In one drive in Texas in 1935, volunteers killed more than 8,000 jackrabbits in a single day. The bodies were piled up and burned. The investigators who later studied the Dust Bowl were not forensic scientists in the modern sense. They were soil scientists, economists, and public health officials. They examined the physical evidence, the depth of topsoil loss, the chemical composition of the dust, the wind patterns. They interviewed hundreds of farmers. They reviewed land records, crop production data, and weather reports. What they found was a clear chain of cause and effect that began not in the 1930s, but in the opening of the plains to settlement decades earlier. The key failure was the lack of understanding of how the plains ecosystem worked. The region had a variable climate. Rainfall could be abundant for several years and then disappear for several more. The native grasses had deep root systems that could survive drought. When the land was plowed for wheat, those roots were destroyed. The wheat had shallower roots and could not hold the soil in place during dry periods. The system relied on the assumption that the wet years would continue. That assumption was wrong. Why did no one see this coming? Some people did. Agricultural experts warned as early as the 1900s that overplowing on the southern plains was risky. But their warnings were ignored because the economy demanded production. During World War I, wheat prices were high. The government encouraged farmers to plant as much wheat as possible. After the war, prices fell, but farmers had to plant even more to cover their debts. When the drought began in 1931, the land was already compromised. The first dust storms that year were small. By 1933, they were regional. By 1935, they were continental. The official response was slow at first. The Roosevelt administration had many priorities in the early 30s. The banking crisis, unemployment, the Tennessee Valley Authority. The Dust Bowl was not a single event that could be addressed by a single program. It was a diffuse, slow-moving disaster that affected a sparsely populated region with little political power. Congress did not pass the Soil Conservation Act until 1935, after Black Sunday had made the crisis visible to the entire nation. But even after the act was passed, the implementation was uneven. The Soil Conservation Service, later renamed the Natural Resources Conservation Service, had to hire staff, develop techniques, and convince farmers to change their practices. Many farmers were skeptical. They had been told by the same government to plow up the grass. Now they were being told to plant trees and build terraces. Some resisted. Others had no money to invest in conservation. The government offered payments for adopting new methods, but the payments were small and the paperwork was heavy. In 1936, the Supreme Court struck down the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which had been the primary vehicle for paying farmers to reduce acreage. This created uncertainty. The Dust Bowl was not only an ecological disaster, it was also a failure of governance. The systems that were supposed to help farmers, crop insurance, disaster relief, agricultural extension, either did not exist or were designed for different conditions. The federal government had to invent new institutions on the fly. One of those institutions was the Resettlement Administration, created in 1935. Its mission was to move struggling families off marginal land and onto better land. It bought up farms that were too damaged to be viable and relocated the families to new communities. The program was controversial. Critics said it was social engineering. Supporters said it was the only rational solution. In practice, the Resettlement Administration moved about 4,400 families before it was reorganized in 1937. That was a small fraction of the total displaced population. The majority of refugees from the Dust Bowl moved on their own, without government help. Those who moved west encountered a different set of problems. California had its own agricultural economy. It needed cheap labor for harvesting crops like cotton, fruit, and vegetables. The migrants from the plains provided that labor, but at a price. They were paid low wages, often below the minimum set by the New Deal's wage codes. They lived in shantytowns called Hoovervilles, named after President Herbert Hoover. The public health conditions were poor. Sanitation was minimal. Disease spread quickly. The migrants were also stigmatized. They were called Okies, a slur that originally referred to anyone from Oklahoma, but was applied to all Dust Bowl refugees regardless of their actual origin. They were accused of being lazy, ignorant, and unsanitary. The reality was the opposite. Most of the migrants had been successful farmers before the drought. They had work ethic, skills, and family structures. What they lacked was capital. They had lost everything in the dust. By 1938, the drought began to recede in the southern plains. Rains returned to parts of Texas and Oklahoma. The dust storms became less frequent, but the recovery was uneven. Some areas never regained their original productivity. The soil that had been lost was gone forever. Farmers who stayed had to adopt new methods. They planted more diversified crops. They used contour plowing and strip cropping. They built ponds to store water. The land slowly healed, but it was a different land than before. The cultural memory of the Dust Bowl has lasted longer than the physical damage. Novels, photographs, songs, and documentaries have kept the story alive. The most famous of these is John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, published in 1939. Steinbeck did not write about the Dust Bowl itself. He wrote about the aftermath, the migration, and the struggle of the Joad family to survive in California. The book captured the sense of loss and injustice that defined the era. It was controversial at the time. Some politicians in California called it communist propaganda, but it resonated with the public because it was true. The photographs of the era are equally powerful. Dorothea Lange, Arthur Rothstein, and Walker Evans worked for the Farm Security Administration. They traveled through the Dust Bowl and took thousands of images. The most famous is Lange's Migrant Mother, a portrait of a woman named Florence Owens Thompson at a pea pickers camp in Nipomo, California. Thompson was 32 years old at the time but looked much older. She had 7 children. She and her family had left Oklahoma after the dust destroyed their farm. The photograph shows her with a furrowed brow and a distant stare, her children huddled around her. It became an icon of the Depression. What is less known is that Thompson's family had been part of the Dust Bowl exodus, but she herself was originally a Native American from Oklahoma. The dust had taken their land before she was born. Her family had moved around. The photograph captured a moment of extreme hardship, but it also captured something universal: the resilience of people who had been broken by a system they could not control. The unanswered question after all the investigations and all the photography is whether the land can ever be made safe again. The Dust Bowl was caused by a combination of natural drought and human error. The drought was natural and will happen again. The human error was the assumption that the plains could be cultivated like the fertile regions of the Midwest. That assumption was wrong then and is still wrong today. In the 21st century, the same region faces a new threat. The Ogallala Aquifer, which provides irrigation water for much of the Texas Panhandle, Kansas, and Nebraska, is being depleted at a rate that far exceeds natural recharge. In some parts of the aquifer, the water level has dropped by more than 100 feet since the 1950s. Without irrigation, the land would become marginal again. If a severe multi-year drought returned, the combination of dry soil and strong winds could produce dust storms similar to those of the 1930s. Agricultural scientists have warned about this. They have proposed more efficient irrigation methods, crop rotation, and returning some land to native grass. But the economic pressure to produce is still strong. Grain prices fluctuate. Farmers take risks. The same cycle that led to the Dust Bowl, high prices, overplowing, debt, drought, could repeat itself. The difference now is that there are more tools available. Conservation programs exist. Weather forecasting is better. Soil science is more advanced. But none of those tools will prevent a new Dust Bowl if the underlying incentives remain the same. The story of the 193s is not only a lesson about soil. It is a lesson about how human systems create vulnerability. The land does not fail by itself. It fails because people decide to use it in a way that cannot be sustained. And so, the dust rises again, in smaller storms, on smaller scales, but with the same chemistry and the same consequences for the people who breathe it in. The question is not whether it could happen again. The question is whether we will recognize the warning signs before the sky turns black once more. On the 14th of April, 1935, at approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a wall of dust nearly 1,000 feet high descended on the town of Guymon, Oklahoma, in the heart of the Oklahoma Panhandle. The day had started clear. Temperatures were mild. Farmers were still working in fields, hoping for spring rain that had not come. By 2 o'clock, a dark line appeared on the western horizon. It looked like a thunderstorm, but it was not. The line advanced at 40 miles per hour. Within 30 minutes, the sky turned from blue to brown to black. People who had been outside rushed indoors. Some did not make it. Visibility dropped to zero. The wind carried sand and silt that could scrape paint off a house. Livestock suffocated where they stood. The storm lasted 3 hours. When it passed, the town was buried under several inches of fine dust. Roads were impassable. Cars were stalled. The air remained thick with suspended particles for days. What happened on that day was not unique. It was one of the most violent of the black blizzards, but similar events had occurred across the southern plains throughout the 193s. The term black blizzard was coined by residents who compared the dust clouds to snowstorms, but the substance was not frozen water. It was topsoil. Each storm carried millions of tons of soil from the Great Plains to the Atlantic Ocean. Some of that dust fell on ships hundreds of miles offshore. In New York City, the sky turned a dull orange for a few hours after a particularly strong storm in May 193. The dust was not just a local problem. It was a national event. The cause of that specific storm on April 14, 1935, was a strong cold front moving south from Canada. The front met hot, dry air over the plains. The temperature gradient created wind speeds that reached 60 miles per hour. Because the ground was bare, no grass, no cover, no moisture, the wind picked up loose soil and launched it into the atmosphere. The geological term for this process is aeolian erosion. It happens naturally in deserts, but the southern plains were not a desert before the plow. They were a grassland. The grass held the soil together. When the grass was gone, the soil became dust. The storm on April 14th became known as Black Sunday. It was not the deadliest dust storm, but it became the most photographed and written about. Photographers from the Farm Security Administration captured images of the sky turning black over towns like Boise City and Dalhart. The photographs were distributed to newspapers across the country. For the first time, Americans outside the plains could see what the Dust Bowl actually looked like. The images were shocking. They showed houses buried up to their windowsills, drifts of dust covering fences, and children wearing dust masks made from old cloth. In the weeks after Black Sunday, the Red Cross opened emergency shelters in churches and schools. The dust had caused a spike in respiratory illnesses, especially pneumonia and silicosis. Doctors reported patients coughing up brown phlegm. The condition was called dust pneumonia. It killed an unknown number of people, mostly the elderly and the very young. No precise death toll exists. County records from the period are incomplete, but researchers estimate that several thousand people died from dust-related diseases between 1930 and 1939. This is a number that is rarely cited in historical accounts, but it represents the human cost of the ecological failure. The medical community at the time had limited understanding of how inhaled dust affected the lungs. They knew that coal miners developed black lung disease, but soil dust was different. The particles in the dust bowl storms were fine enough to reach the deepest parts of the respiratory system, the alveoli. Once there, the body could not remove them. Over time, the accumulated particles caused scarring and fibrosis. This is similar to the condition known as silicosis, which is caused by inhaling crystalline silica dust. The dust in the southern plains contained silica from the soil. It was a slow poison. State health departments began collecting statistics in 1935, but the data was inconsistent. In Kansas, for example, deaths attributed to pneumonia rose by more than 30% in 1935 compared to 1934. Many of those deaths were likely caused by dust pneumonia. In Texas, the Panhandle counties reported a similar increase, but without autopsies or standardized reporting, the true numbers remain unknown. The federal government responded by providing emergency relief. The Works Progress Administration, or WPA, paid for the construction of hospitals and clinics in the affected regions. The Public Health Service sent teams of doctors and nurses to treat the sick. They set up temporary clinics in schoolhouses and train stations, but the scale of the disaster exceeded the capacity of the relief system. Many people simply left. They packed what they could into cars and trucks and headed west. The migration that began in the early 193s accelerated after Black Sunday. In 1935 alone, an estimated 100,000 people left Oklahoma and the Texas Panhandle for California. The migrants did not all go to California. Some went to Arizona, New Mexico, or Colorado. Some moved to cities like Denver, Kansas City, or Dallas. But the majority aimed for the agricultural valleys of California, where they had heard that jobs were available. They had heard this from letters sent by earlier migrants, from newspaper ads placed by growers, and from the stories told by rail workers. The reality was different. The jobs existed, but they were seasonal and low-paying. The competition for work was fierce. The migrants were often exploited by labor contractors who charged fees for transportation and housing. The housing was a problem in itself. Many migrants lived in tent camps along irrigation ditches. They built shacks from scrap lumber, tar paper, and cardboard. The camps were informal and often unsanitary. There were no toilets. Water came from contaminated irrigation canals. Dysentery and typhoid fever spread quickly. The children suffered the most. Mortality rates among migrant children were higher than the national average. The federal government eventually established migratory labor camps, run by the Farm Security Administration. These camps had clean water, showers, and toilets. They were a lifeline, but they housed only a fraction of the new arrivals. The growers in California opposed these camps. They argued that the federal government was interfering with the labor market. They wanted a surplus of workers so that wages would stay low. The growers had political influence in Sacramento and Washington. They blocked efforts to establish a minimum wage for agricultural workers. The migrants had no union. They had no political voice. They were trapped in a system that used them when needed and discarded them when not. This system is documented in the reports of the La Follette Civil Liberties Committee, a Senate subcommittee that investigated violations of workers' rights in the 193s and 1940s. The committee found that growers in California used strikebreakers, private police, and vigilante violence to suppress labor organizing. In 1936, during a cotton strike in the San Joaquin Valley, growers evicted striking workers from company-owned housing. They had local sheriffs arrest picketers on charges of vagrancy. The federal government did not intervene. The Dust Bowl refugees who had fled the dust were now facing a different kind of oppression. Meanwhile, back on the plains, the federal government continued its conservation efforts. The Soil Conservation Service, now led by Hugh Hammond Bennett, pushed forward with demonstration projects. Bennett was a geologist who had studied soil erosion for decades. He knew that the Dust Bowl was preventable. He said publicly that the solution was to heal the land. He traveled across the plains, talking to farmers, showing them how strip cropping and terracing could hold the soil. He also pushed for the creation of the national grasslands, large tracts of land that would be permanently restored to native grasses. The national grasslands were established in the 193s and 194s. The federal government purchased damaged land and reseeded it with native species like buffalo grass and blue grama. These areas were fenced off from plowing and grazing. Over time, they recovered. Today, the national grasslands cover about 4 million acres across the Great Plains. They are a legacy of the Dust Bowl. They are also a reminder that the land can heal if given the chance. But not all land was purchased. Many families stayed, they adapted. They dug ponds to catch rainwater. They planted shelter belts, rows of trees that broke the wind. They rotated crops and left fields fallow. They learned to farm in a way that respected the limits of the environment. By 1940, the rains had returned. The wheat harvest was good. The dust storm stopped. The crisis was over, but the scars remained. The long-term effects on the population are still being studied. A 2019 study published in the Journal of Political Economy examined the health outcomes of children who lived through the Dust Bowl. The researchers found that exposure to dust storms during childhood led to reduced lung function in adulthood. They also found that the children who moved to California and other states did not recover fully. The damage was permanent. The study estimated that the Dust Bowl caused a loss of life expectancy among the affected population of about 1 to 3 years, depending on the severity of exposure. This is the legacy that the history books do not always capture. The Dust Bowl was not just a dramatic event. It was a slow, grinding disaster that killed people decades after the dust settled. The bodies of the survivors carried the dust inside them. The medical records from the 1960s and 1970s show higher rates of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease among people who lived in the Dust Bowl region during the 1930s than among those who lived elsewhere. The correlation holds even when controlling for smoking and other factors. The question of who was responsible for the Dust Bowl has been debated by historians, economists, and environmentalists. Some argue that the federal government was to blame because it encouraged homesteading on land that should never have been plowed. Others point to the railroads, which sold the land to settlers and then used it as collateral for loans. Some blame the banks, which lent money for tractors and machinery. Some blame the farmers themselves, who ignored the warnings of ecologists like John Wesley Powell, who had argued in the 19th century that the Great Plains required a different type of agriculture. Powell had mapped the West in the 1870s. He calculated that the region east of the 100th meridian had enough rainfall for conventional agriculture, but the region west of it did not. The 100th meridian runs roughly through the middle of the Dakotas, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. It separates the humid east from the semi-arid west. Powell warned that any settlement west of that line would require irrigation or some form of dry farming that conserved moisture. His warnings were ignored because they conflicted with the national ideology of expansion and progress. The Dust Bowl was, in part, a delayed validation of Powell's analysis. In the decades after the Dust Bowl, the federal government changed its approach to agriculture. The Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment Act of 1936 replaced the Agricultural Adjustment Act. It paid farmers specifically for conservation practices, like building terraces and planting cover crops. The Soil Conservation Service worked with local soil conservation districts, which were created at the county level. These districts gave farmers a direct voice in conservation planning. By 1950, there were more than 2,000 soil conservation districts across the country. The farm subsidy system also evolved. In the 1940s and 1950s, the government continued to support prices for wheat, cotton, and other commodities. Farmers received payments for leaving land idle. This was intended to prevent overproduction and soil exhaustion, but the system had unintended consequences. It encouraged farmers to strip the most productive land and leave the marginal land idle. Marginal land reverted to grass, which was good for conservation, but the productive land was still plowed, sometimes with little regard for erosion. By the 1960s, a new problem emerged. The widespread use of irrigation from the Ogallala Aquifer allowed farmers to grow crops in areas that had been subject to dust storms in the 1930s. The irrigation created a false sense of security. Farmers no longer needed to rely on rainfall. They could pump water from underground. The Dust Bowl was forgotten by many. The fields were green again, but the water was finite. In the 1970s, a drought similar in intensity to the 1930s hit the southern plains. But because of irrigation, the dust storms did not return. The field stayed green. The topsoil remained in place. The difference was water. In 1930, there was no irrigation. The farmers depended entirely on rainfall. When the rain stopped, the land turned to dust. In the 1970s, the farmers had deep wells, some more than 1,000 feet deep, that drew from the aquifer. They could pump water even in a drought. The land was productive, but the water was being depleted. That depletion continues today. In some parts of the Texas Panhandle, the water table has dropped by more than 200 feet since the 1950s. The cost of pumping has increased. Some farmers have switched to more water-efficient crops like corn and sorghum. Others have converted to dryland farming, returning to the same methods that failed in the 1930s. The cycle is repeating itself, albeit with better tools and knowledge. The question of whether the Dust Bowl could happen again is not a hypothetical. The atmospheric conditions that caused the drought of the 1930s have been studied extensively. Tree ring records show that severe droughts occurred in the Great Plains roughly every 20 to 50 years for the past 500 years. The 1930s drought was not unique in its severity. It was unique because of the human response to it. The plow had made the land vulnerable. If a similar drought occurs in the future, and if the land is again plowed without conservation measures, the dust storms will return. The difference this time would be the size of the population. In 1930, the population of the Dust Bowl region was about 2 million people. Today, it is about 6 million. The migration that would follow a new Dust Bowl would be unprecedented. The infrastructure for relief would be strained. The economic losses would be measured in hundreds of billions of dollars. The human cost would be immeasurable. And yet, there are signs that the warning is being taken seriously. The Natural Resources Conservation Service, successor to the Soil Conservation Service, now has a program called the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, which provides funding for conservation practices. The Conservation Reserve Program pays farmers to take environmentally sensitive land out of production for 10 years. In 2020, the program had about 22 million acres enrolled, with the highest concentration in the Great Plains. It is not enough, but it is a start. The story of the Dust Bowl is not only a story of the past, it is a story of the present. Every time a farmer plows a field without considering the wind, every time a developer builds a subdivision on former grassland, every time a policymaker ignores the long-term health of the soil, the conditions for the next Dust Bowl are being created. The cycle of boom and bust is embedded in the landscape. The only question is when the next bust will come. In the early morning hours of April 14, 1935, a day that would later be called Black Sunday, the sky over the Texas Panhandle was clear. At 8 a.m., the temperature was mild. Farmers in Guymon, Oklahoma and Dalhart, Texas were preparing for a day of work. By 10 a.m., the wind had picked up. It was not unusual. The plains were always windy, but by 1 p.m. the wind had become something else. It carried a fine brown dust that stung the eyes and coated the skin. By 2 p.m. the dust was so thick that the sun was blocked entirely. People who were outside described it as a wall of dirt moving across the horizon. It was a supercell of dust, more than 1,000 feet high, traveling at speeds of up to 40 miles per hour. What happened? That single storm moved an estimated 300 million tons of topsoil from the Great Plains into the Atlantic Ocean. It was not the largest dust storm of the decade, but it was the most memorable because it struck the most populated area. The storm buried houses, cars, and livestock. It turned day into night. People who were caught outside tied handkerchiefs over their faces and crawled toward shelter. Some did not make it. In one case, a family in Beaver County, Oklahoma, was trapped in their car. They suffocated before they could reach a farmhouse. The storm lasted only a few hours, but its effects lingered for weeks. The dust settled in layers. It was fine enough to seep through cracks in windows and doors. People slept with wet cloths over their faces. When they woke, their pillows were covered in grit. How could this have happened? The answer lies in the land itself and in the decisions made 30 years earlier. By 1935, the southern plains had been plowed at an unprecedented scale. The wheat boom had turned native grassland into exposed soil. When the drought came, there was nothing to hold the dirt in place. The wind did the rest. But the storm on Black Sunday was not an isolated event. It was part of a pattern that had been building since the early 193s rose. The first major dust storms appeared in 193 woe. By 1934, they were occurring with increasing frequency. In 1935, they reached their peak. The storms were so severe that they darkened the sky as far east as Chicago and New York. People in Manhattan saw brown snow fall from the sky. The dust was lifted high into the atmosphere and carried by the jet stream. The scientific community was slow to respond. The United States Weather Bureau had been tracking the drought since 1931, but they had no system for predicting dust storms. The first systematic study of dust storms was conducted by a meteorologist named H. Clayton in 193. Clayton collected data from weather stations across the plains and found that the dust storms were associated with a pattern of high atmospheric pressure over the western United States and low pressure over the Gulf of Mexico. This created strong winds from the northwest that swept across the exposed soils. Clayton's work was important, but it did not prevent the storms. It only described them. The human cost of Black Sunday was not fully tallied until years later. The storm caused the deaths of at least 7 people directly, but the indirect deaths from respiratory illness were far higher. In the year following Black Sunday, the pneumonia rate in the Dust Bowl region increased by 30%. Hospitals in Amarillo and Dodge City reported a surge in cases of acute bronchitis and silicosis. The dust was not just dirt. It contained silica, a mineral that can cause scarring in the lungs. The long-term exposure to silica dust is now known to cause a condition called progressive massive fibrosis, a form of black lung disease similar to that seen in coal miners. The Dust Bowl was an environmental disaster that turned into a public health crisis. The federal response to Black Sunday was immediate, in a manner of speaking. 2 days after the storm, the Soil Conservation Service was formally established as a permanent agency. Hugh Hammond Bennett, the founder of the service, traveled to Washington to testify before Congress. He brought with him a jar of dust that had fallen on the Capitol building the previous year. He told the lawmakers that the topsoil of the Great Plains was being blown away at a rate that would leave the region uninhabitable within a generation. Congress listened. The agency was given funding to expand its operations. By the end of 1935, the Soil Conservation Service had established demonstration projects in every Dust Bowl state. Farmers were paid to plant trees and build terraces. They were taught to plow along the contour of the land rather than in straight lines. But the problem was not solved overnight. The federal conservation programs were voluntary. Farmers could choose to ignore them. Many did. In 1936, a drought more severe than 1934 hit the region. The dust storms returned with equal intensity. The Soil Conservation Service reported that in March 1936, a single storm removed an estimated 500,000 tons of soil from a single county in Kansas. The wind carried that soil to the Great Lakes, where it was observed by shipping captains as a brown haze over the water. Why did the conservation programs fail to stop the storms? The answer is that the programs were designed to prevent future erosion, not to stop the current one. By 1936, the topsoil in many areas was already gone. The farmers were fighting a war they had already lost. The land could not be saved. It had to be abandoned. The federal government began buying up the most degraded land through the Resettlement Administration and later the Farm Security Administration. These agencies purchased about 11 million acres of farmland in the Great Plains between 1935 and 1940. The land was replanted with native grasses and set aside as federal property. Some of it later became part of the National Grassland System. The migration of the Dust Bowl survivors continued through the late 1930s. The peak of the migration was in 1937, when about 350,000 people left the plains. Many went to California, but others went to the Pacific Northwest, the Rocky Mountains, and even Alaska. The migrants faced discrimination and poverty in their new homes. In California, they were housed in labor camps built by the Farm Security Administration. The camps provided basic sanitation, medical care, and education for children, but they were also overcrowded and underfunded. The migrants lived in tents and shacks made of scrap wood and canvas. The birth rate in the camps was high, but so was the infant mortality rate. The children who survived grew up with memories of hunger and dust, even if they did not live through the storms themselves. By 1940, the drought had ended. The rain returned to the plains. The federal conservation programs continued, and the land began to recover. The soil was still thin, but the grass grew back. The dust storms became less frequent, but the damage was already done. The population of the region never fully recovered. Many of the towns that had been thriving in 1930 were ghost towns by 1940. The economy shifted from agriculture to petroleum. The discovery of oil in the Permian Basin of Texas and the Anadarko Basin of Oklahoma created new jobs, but the oil fields were not as labor-intensive as farming. The population of the region continued to decline through the 1940s and 1950s. In the history of the American West, the Dust Bowl is often taught as a cautionary tale about the tragedy of the commons, but the reality is more complex. The Dust Bowl was not a natural disaster. It was a man-made disaster that was exacerbated by natural forces. The drought was inevitable. The wind was inevitable, but the exposure of the soil was not. The land had been stable for millennia before the plow arrived. The question of responsibility is not a question of who to blame, but a question of what the land could have taught us if we had listened. The story of the Dust Bowl is also a story of resilience. The people who stayed did not give up. They adapted. Some switched to dryland farming techniques, such as fallowing and strip cropping. Others left the land fallow for years at a time, allowing the grass to regenerate. The cattle ranchers who had been displaced by the plow returned after the dust storms. The ranchers had a different relationship with the land. They understood that the plains were not meant for wheat. They understood that the grass was the only thing holding the soil in place. By the 1950s, the region had become more balanced. Wheat was still grown, but it was alternated with pasture. The dust storms that did occur were minor compared with the 1930s, but the lessons of the Dust Bowl were not only about agriculture. They were about government intervention. The New Deal programs that saved the plains also saved the people. The Resettlement Administration, the Farm Security Administration, the Soil Conservation Service, the Works Progress Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps. These agencies provided jobs, meals, and hope. They built roads, schools, and clinics. They planted trees and built terraces. They gave people a reason to stay, and when people left, they helped them start over. The Dust Bowl was a test of the New Deal, and the New Deal passed. The question that remains today is whether the political will to intervene on that scale still exists. The Conservation Reserve Program is a shadow of the Soil Conservation Service. In the 1980s, the program paid farmers to idle about 45 million acres at its peak. By 2020, that number had fallen to 22 million. The government has not bought degraded land since the 193s rose. The land that was set aside then is still federal property, but the rest of the region is vulnerable. The Ogallala Aquifer, which allowed the Great Plains to become a breadbasket, is being depleted at a rate of about 2% per year. When the water runs out, the irrigation will stop. The land will revert to dryland farming, or it will revert to grassland. Either way, the dust will return. The Dust Bowl was not an accident. It was a consequence of a culture that believed the land was an infinite resource. That culture has not changed. It has only become more sophisticated. The tractors are bigger, the irrigation is deeper, and the fertilizers are more potent. But the soil is still finite. The wind is still blowing. The drought will come again. The only question that matters is whether we will be ready. On February 26, 2012, a massive dust storm swept across the Texas Panhandle. It was not as large as the storms of the 193s rose, but it was large enough to close highways and ground flights. The National Weather Service issued a blowing dust advisory. Visibility dropped to near zero in some areas. The storm carried soil from drought-stricken fields in the region. That year, the southern plains were in the grip of a severe drought, the worst since the 195s. The topsoil had been loosened by months of dry weather. A strong cold front pushed southward, lifting the dust into the air. The plume stretched from Amarillo to Oklahoma City. At its peak, the storm reduced visibility to less than 1/4 of a mile. An elderly woman in Lubbock suffered a heart attack while trying to drive through the dust. She pulled over and waited for the storm to pass. She survived, but the ambulance that was called to help could not reach her for more than an hour because the roads were blocked by abandoned vehicles. The 2012 dust storm raised an uncomfortable question: how much progress had really been made? The conservation programs of the New Deal had restored the grasslands, but those grasslands were now under pressure again. The price of wheat had been high, and farmers had plowed up millions of acres of native pasture to plant crops. The federal crop insurance program encouraged this by guaranteeing income even when the weather failed. The result was a landscape that looked stable on the surface but was fragile underneath. The same forces that had created the Dust Bowl were operating again. The only difference was that the government now had a system in place to manage the consequences. What had changed? The technology was better. The plows were bigger. The irrigation systems were more efficient, but the soil was still vulnerable. The Conservation Reserve Program, which paid farmers to keep land in grass, had been reduced by Congress in the 199s and 20s. By 2012, only about 27 million acres were enrolled, down from a peak of 36 million. The land that had been taken out of the program was often the most erodible. When the drought came, those fields became the source of the dust. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration documented the event and concluded that the storm was a direct result of land use decisions made years earlier. The agency warned that without a renewed commitment to conservation, the Great Plains could see a return of the conditions that defined the 193s rose. The response to the 2012 storm was muted. There were no congressional hearings. No new agencies were created. The local media covered the event for a day or two, then moved on. The public had short memories. The Dust Bowl had become a textbook chapter, not a lived reality. But the people who lived through the 193s rose were still alive. Some of them saw the 2012 storm on television. They recognized the sign. They knew what it meant. The deeper question that investigators of the 2012 dust storm could not answer was whether the system had learned from the past. The Conservation Reserve Program was funded, but it was not mandatory. Farmers could choose to enroll their land or they could choose to plow it. The government could not force them to conserve. The only tool was financial incentive, and that incentive was often weaker than the market price of wheat. In 2011, wheat prices had reached a record high. Farmers responded by planting every available acre. They knew the drought was coming. They knew the soil was fragile, but they also knew that the government would pay them if the crop failed. The federal crop insurance program had become the new safety net. It had replaced the old safety net of the Soil Conservation Service. The difference was that the old net tried to prevent the disaster. The new net only paid for the damage after it happened. How could this have happened again? The answer is that the institutional memory had faded. The Soil Conservation Service no longer existed. It had been renamed the Natural Resources Conservation Service in 1994, and its mission had been broadened to include water quality, wildlife habitat, and urban forestry. The focus on wind erosion had been diluted. The NRCS still operated the same demonstration farms and provided technical assistance, but its funding had not kept pace with the scale of the problem. In 1935, the government had bought degraded land outright. In 2012, it could only pay farmers to leave land idle for 10 years at a time. After the contract expired, the farmer could plow it again. The long-term solution that Hugh Hammond Bennett had envisioned was never fully implemented. The 2012 storm did not become a second Dust Bowl because the drought ended the following year. The rains returned and the grass grew back. The crisis passed, but the underlying vulnerability did not. The Ogallala Aquifer, which supplies water for irrigation across 8 states, was being depleted at an accelerating rate. In the Texas Panhandle, the water table had dropped by as much as 150 feet since the 1950s. When the aquifer runs dry, the irrigation will stop. The land will revert to dryland farming, or it will revert to grassland. Either way, the dust will return. The wind will blow. The sun will bake the soil. The only question that remains is whether the farmers who come after will have learned the lesson that the Dust Bowl tried to teach.